Never mistake what is just a trigger for being the actual source of your depression or your anxiety. In particular, there are 6 very common triggers or wrongly attributed sources that people tend to look at that they believe are the actual source of the problem when they're just not. So I can tell you the most common 6 are: number 1, your genetics. Your genetics are not the cause of your depression or your anxiety. It's useful to look at, might be helpful to understand a little bit of the context of what your family tree is, but we cannot most accurately describe depression and anxiety as a purely genetic experience. It is by far not at all the most significant factor in understanding how we can actually help you create real changes. So that's not it. Number 2, it's certainly not just your biochemistry. Again, that's helpful to look at, but the thing to understand here is that when you are in a perpetual pattern of depression or anxiety consistently, there is a biochemical corollary for every emotional state that you are in, okay? And what this means is we could try to manipulate your brain chemistry or just approach this from the somatic approach, but it's not going to really help you because you've got some very ingrained patterns cognitively, behaviorally, and emotionally that have to get dealt with in order for us to really deal with the actual source of the problem. So the biochemistry is something useful to look out potentially, and it can be a coping mechanism, but never more than that, because we can artificially change what's going on in your brain, but that's not going to help you actually create a real solution. So the real source of the problem is not your biochemistry. Number 3 would be your boss or your work environment. People tend to look at the demands that they are under in a professional environment as the source of their problem because they dread going into work. And I have clients like this every day of the week. And I'll share with you that it's just not the case, because if you reflect on this for a moment, you can appreciate that there are other individuals who are in your same experience of work that may be in the exact same role or a parallel industry, or people who are dealing with maybe 3, 5 to 10 times higher demands on their time or their mental capacity. And those individuals are not necessarily dealing with patterns of depression or anxiety. So what we have to appreciate is that your external world is not what determines your internal world. In fact, it's just the opposite. Your internal world is what dictates your external world. So what we have to help you do is make sure that being able to show up in your work environment, create new patterns of cognition, of emotion and behavior that actually serve you show up automatically, as opposed to the old limiting patterns of depression or anxiety that tend to grab hold of you and dictate how you respond in that environment. So it's not your boss or your work. The 4th big thing that people wrongfully attribute to being the cause of their depression or anxiety is their relationships or lack thereof. So people tend to look at a sense of loneliness or a divorce or a failed marriage or a relationship that's just not going well as the thing that is the source of the depression or the anxiety. Well, I'll share with you that that's not exactly the full picture. And what we mean by that is, usually when I start with my very first clients, I help them understand that there are a few things that dictate their experience of depression or anxiety more than anything else. And one of those is the language and the meaning that they are using to describe their experience. So for instance, I had a client, a group of clients, a couple that is, a couple years ago. And inside of my client session with them, I recalled that the husband had said, I'm miserable in my marriage because she never does anything nice to me. And he said that over and over and over again, probably about 6 times inside of the session. And all of a sudden, I realized that she had literally said very nice things to him inside of the session. And I said, what about when she said this a moment ago? And he said, what are you talking about? That's not what she said. She didn't say that. So he had quite literally deleted the exact sentence that she said to him just a few moments prior that was actually very nice and kind and loving and warm. And he had manipulated exactly what it was that she was saying to him. So one thing I help people understand is that what is going on in your life, what the actual circumstances of your life are, is not what is causing your depression or your anxiety, but rather the meanings that you are ascribing to your life circumstances is a much larger indicator of whether or not you're going to be depressed or anxious. So it may be true that your marriage is not where you want it to be. It may be true that you've been out of a relationship for longer than you'd like to be. But the factual element of where your relationship stands is not the cause of the depression. What is in your external world is not the cause of it. The internal world is the cause. The internal world that says, well, my marriage is over. So in essence, it's not what is happening in the external world that is causing the internal world, but rather it is the representations we have as well as the patterns that you're generating in the internal world that are affecting the external world. Okay, so the next thing to understand too, which is a very commonly misattributed cause, it's not a cause, but is very often a trigger, are health problems. So you may be experiencing something where you dealt with an injury or you have a pre-existing condition or something along those lines, and you tend to think a lot about your health. You tend to worry about what's happened or what may happen or what have you. But again, this is not the source of the problem. The source of the problem is not the actual challenge you're having with your health, because some people have plenty of health challenges who are perfectly well adjusted with no anxiety, with no depression, and they're perfectly fine to continue to live their lives despite what it is that they may have had happen wrong or they may be dealing with right now. So that's the thing to get curious about, is why is it that some individuals could literally have a terminal illness and actually still be feeling a sense of gratitude, a sense of excitement, and so forth, while some individuals may not even have any sort of chronic health challenge or anything along those lines, yet they're still feeling a sense of neuroticism about it. Okay, so it's not necessarily any specific health issue that you've had. And then the final sixth thing that people wrongfully attribute to being the actual source of the problem, which is just not it, is your social situations. Or in particular, a lot of people have challenges going out in public and going to the grocery store, being in crowds, being in a situation where they have a sense of social anxiety. Well, it's not exactly accurate to say that the crowds themselves are what is the cause of the anxiety, because certainly individuals are able to be in crowds without anxiety. It's not as if there is something unique about crowds that just magically creates this experience of anxiety. What we have to understand is that there's something going on internally. There's a conditioned pattern that has a few elements, one of them being the meaning that you ascribe to the crowded situation, and another being particularly what element of that experience are you focused on, right? So are you focused on simply being out, having fun, being able to be present, or are you focused on an idea that everybody around you seems to be looking at you even though they're not, okay? Which is very often what happens for people dealing with that type of anxious problem. So the bottom line is this: you cannot wrongfully attribute what triggers you as being the source, and what the other implication of that is that you don't want to create a life where you're just removing yourself from triggers and further insulating yourself, because you will always find something to generate a sense of depression or anxiety about. And very often the people who remove themselves from work or those situations are still feeling anxious. It's just that they've found a different environment to manifest that in. So bottom line is, in order to actually get clear on the source, you got to understand that anxiety and depression come from a series of internal patterns of emotion, cognition, and behavior. And until you actually understand what goes into creating those patterns and how to turn them around, then you're going to be stuck.